Good morning YouTube, it's 5:30 on Wednesday morning. I'm down in Falmouth today in Cornwall because I'm working down here at the moment, and I'm just thinking about this TJ Does Life versus Amazing Atheist channels really, and the difficulty of being of entertainment as an idea. I mean, it's difficult to do anyway, but just the idea of that is difficult. Particularly when you contrast it perhaps to Communicator or Alligator. And I mean, what it put me in mind of is, it put me in mind of an experience I had a few years back actually. I used to live in Newcastle-upon-Tyne, which is this really great city in the northeast of England. I haven't lived there for over 20 years, but I used to live there about 25 years ago. And when I was there, I used to kind of hang around with quite a large bunch of fairly lefty, fairly anarchic, a bunch of slackers really, slightly druggy, slightly drunk slackers. And two of these slackers, I didn't know them terribly well, but two of these guys were Chris and Simon Donald, and they started up a magazine, just a kind of semi-stat photocopied magazine called Viz Comic, which they distributed at punk rock gigs largely, and I think they started selling through a couple of record shops. And they had a market of maybe a few dozen, maybe a couple of hundred people would buy this thing. And everybody who was involved, everybody who kind of hung around in that group, and as I say, I didn't know those two particularly well, but I knew a lot of people who knew them and who were involved in that circuit. And if you were one of the people who knew it, you would perhaps contribute to it. They used to do these kind of like spoof kind of photo love essays, and people that I knew would be involved in that. Or you would write a spoof letter. The comic itself was a kind of piss take of 1960s and 70s and earlier kids comics like The Dandy and the Beano, but full of really, really filthy and violent content. It was hysterically funny. Some great characters in that comic actually, which I was reminded of recently. One of the characters in there was called Finbar Saunders, and the strapline was Finbar Saunders and his double entendres. And basically that strip is just a succession of sexual double entendres. Hysterical. Paul Wicker, the Tall Vicar, the Crap Sharks, Sid the Sexist, the Fat Slags, just fantastic stuff. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so it's a relatively small coterie of people gathered around this thing and contributed to it, or were tangentially involved, or just local fans of it. It was like a little fanzine, and it was like that for months really. And then suddenly Viz Comic just took off. I don't know how exactly it happened. Somebody must have seen it and thought this got a wider market, and it just took off. It just exploded nationwide really. So within a year or maybe a year and a half tops, it went from, as I say, having a sales in the dozens, just distributed through local record shops, to national distribution, outselling national newspapers. As I say, it was selling more than national newspapers, more than the Radio Times people were saying at the time, and just became fabulously popular. And it was really interesting what happened to that. I think Chris and Simon Donald bailed out at some point. Not long after that, they either took a back seat or maybe got rid of it completely. I can't remember exactly. But all kinds of things happened around that. The first thing that happened is this conversation around the comic. The kind of conversation that took place in pubs and in people's living rooms about what kind of thing would be good to have in it. A conversation with the buyers, a conversation with the people who actually read the thing. That stopped being possible. I mean, you can get letters coming into the editors. I mean, those things could continue, of course, but there was no supporting conversation from which this comic arose, and certainly no sense of there being any contributing content really. Apart from little bits of letters, there was no sense of anyone, being featuring within the spoof photo love stuff or anything like that. So the conversation around it became impossible, and also the constituency enlarged dramatically. So instead of just, as I say, just being a few dozen people or a couple of hundred people, it suddenly became tens of thousands of people reading this thing of all different kinds. So it wasn't, the constituency was much larger and much more varied. And I remember some very dramatic things happening around that kind of. I mean, as I say, the primary readership in the early days was these was slightly druggy, slacker anarcho types, and people who kind of understood the ironies of the comic, if you like. At least that was the theory, that we understood the ironies of it. And it was quite chastening to be down the big market in Newcastle. The big market is like the strip in Newcastle where all the nightclubs and bars are. It's quite well known for, you know, well, it's well known for fights, but it's also well known for people getting dressed up on a Friday night and going down there. And it was quite odd to be down in the big market on a Friday night, and there'd be these, you know, young, relatively well-off men with really over-styled hair, quoting lines from Sid the Sexist or quoting lines from Fat Slags in a totally unironic context. Not taking it seriously, but stripped of all that strange context to do with how you know, what you're supposed to know to be able to get those jokes, really. It's quite odd, that, really. Yeah, and also just what happened to that constitution of readers. It's no longer a narrowly defined constitution of readers. It's a very broad constitution of readers, and you can't really talk to the readership anymore because the readership is too multivalent. It's too amorphous. There's no possibility of communication. All you can do is kind of throw a comic at them every month. So things just really changed, I think, at that point, and I can't bear to read this comic now. I think it certainly still produces Christmas specials, and they're still in the same vein. You know, they're still basically endless, stupid sexual innuendo and episodes of meaningless violence, all done still in a northern accent. I mean, that was one of the funny things about it. All the writings of the characters is all done in Geordie accents, which is great. So that's maintained, but it's completely lost its kind of charm, unfortunately, because you don't feel as if you're being communicated with. You feel like you're being included with a mass of people that you wouldn't really want to be standing next to. Okay, the reason why I'm saying this is because it relates to this Amazing Atheist thing, as I said. You know, I mean, I don't know what the Amazing Atheist constituency is like, but I'm guessing with a number of subscribers in the, well, over 100,000, there's going to be a huge range of what kind of people you've got there. And yeah, with a number that size, you're going to have fascists, you're going to have child molesters, you're going to have people in the extreme right, people in the extreme left. You're going to have, you know, 13-year-old kids who've, oh, I don't know, you just get all kinds of people. It's just in the nature of the beast when you've got those large figures, and that's an odd constituency. So I personally, and I'm sure some other people at least, feel slightly uncomfortable about being entertained in the sense of pressed up too closely to a lot of those people. Although not the other subscribers are fantastic, I have no doubt about that at all. And also just this communication thing. I mean, you make a distinction between communicator and entertainer, and I think that's fine. But the difference, I think, that YouTube and other communication forms really brings out and changes is conversationalist. You know, a lot of YouTube is, I think, is based on conversation, in the way, kind of in the same way that the early days of Viz was based on conversation. The comic emerged out of conversations in pubs and people's living rooms, and a lot of the videos here, I think, emerge out of conversations with people with other videos. Actually, Mel on Mel's Basket Case actually she didn't make a similar point, but she identified her own practice on video as coming out of writing fanzines and being involved in kind of music fanzine business earlier, well, not business, you know, that activity earlier on. And I think that's the distinction, because I think what you're doing, TJ, on the TJ Does Life, yes, it's communicating, but I'm not sure it's conversational yet, or I'm not sure if conversation is viable, even with just 10,000 subscribers. And I don't know how you would manage to keep the conversational sense going when you've got over 100,000 subscribers. At that point, I guess it has to be either communication and or entertainment, or both. Anyway, they're fairly rambling thoughts, but yeah, it's just, I guess I'm just interested in what happens to conversation when subscriber bases get past a certain point. Thanks very much.